Have you ever wondered how a rebellion, one born of gunpowder, rumors, and resentment, could change the fate of an entire subcontinent? In 1857, British rule in India stood on the edge of a knife. What began as whispers among the Indian sepoys, soldiers under British command, erupted into a full-scale revolt. Known in Britain as the Indian Mutiny, but in India as the First War of Independence, it shook the very foundations of imperial control. But what followed was even more transformative. The British response to this revolt was merciless. Entire villages were burned, and thousands of people were executed, and the rebellion was crushed, but its legacy would be irreversible. The East India Company, once the commercial juggernaut behind Britain's foothold in India, was dissolved. Its failure marked the beginning of direct rule under the British Crown. A new chapter had begun, one known as the British Raj. From 1858 to 1947, the British Raj would govern over a land of more than 300 million people. It was a time of grand architecture and railways, of English-educated elites and viceroys draped in splendor. But behind the pageantry, it was also a time of control, discrimination, unrest, and ultimately, revolution. The beginning of the Raj started when Queen Victoria was declared Empress of India in 1876. To many Britons, this was the pinnacle of imperial achievement, a symbol of glory. But for millions of Indians, it was the formalization of subjugation. Through the Government of India Act in 1858, a new political structure was imposed. India would now be governed by a British-appointed viceroy, advised by a council, and ultimately answerable only to London. Yet, British officials didn't operate in a vacuum. They relied heavily on Indian administrators, tax collectors, teachers, and clerks, especially the new Indian middle class. These were the sons of landowners and merchants, educated in English schools, reading Shakespeare and John Stuart Mill, yet deeply aware that they were barred from true power. Here lies one of the great ironies of empire. The Raj provided this education with the intention to mold loyal subjects. Instead, it produced critics, philosophers, poets, and eventually revolutionaries. But change didn't come overnight. The Raj initially pursued reforms. Railways stretched across the land, connecting distant provinces. Irrigation projects brought water to once barren lands, and Western medicine spread throughout India. But these advancements were not purely selfless. They served empire. Railways transported troops and raw materials. Irrigation improved agricultural output for export. Even education, while expansive, was deeply selective, reinforcing British values and social hierarchies. At the same time, the British worked to prevent future rebellions. They did this by reorganizing the Indian Army and dividing regiments by religion and ethnicity. They separated Punjabis, Gurkhas, Bengalis and others, creating artificial divisions to prevent unity. And there was another constant: racial hierarchy. Despite India being the so-called jewel in the crown, Indians were treated as second-class citizens in their own land. British-only clubs and neighborhoods emerged, and laws favored European settlers. This meant that Indian voices were often silenced or ignored. But seeds of change had already taken root. In 1885, a group of educated Indians founded the Indian National Congress. Initially, this organization was moderate and sought representation and reform, not revolution. They sent petitions, not protesters. They argued for inclusion, not independence. But over time, frustration grew. Why were Indian soldiers good enough to fight for Britain in Africa, but not trusted to command in India? Why were Indian businesses stifled by British imports? And why did decisions about Indian lives continue to be made in London, not Delhi? In the early 20th century, more assertive voices emerged. One of the most prominent was Bal Gangadhar Tilak, who declared, "Swaraj is my birthright, and I shall have it." Swaraj is a word that meant self-rule or independence, and it was no longer a distant dream. It was a rallying cry. Parallel to this was the emergence of identity-based politics. In 1906, the All India Muslim League was formed to represent Muslim concerns in an increasingly Hindu-dominated nationalist discourse, and while initially cooperative with the Indian National Congress, differences widened, setting the stage for future division. Then came the man who would forever change the face of the freedom struggle, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Educated in London, trained as a lawyer in South Africa, Gandhi returned to India not with violence, but with a new philosophy called Satyagraha, meaning holding firmly to truth or truth force. He preached non-violent resistance, mass civil disobedience, strikes, boycotts and marches, not bullets. His first major campaign, the Non-Cooperation Movement of 1920, mobilized millions of people. This movement saw Indians burning British cloth, lawyers refused to attend court, students walked out of colonial schools, and yet, when protests turned violent in Chauri Chaura, Gandhi suspended the movement, proving his commitment to non-violence was not just strategy, it was principle. But while Gandhi inspired the masses, Britain remained unmoved. By the 1930s, civil disobedience escalated. Gandhi's Salt March in 1930 was a masterstroke of symbolism, walking 240 miles to make salt from the sea. He defied Britain's monopoly and galvanized a nation. Still, Britain refused to loosen its grip. And then came World War II. India once again found itself fighting under Britain's banner, this time against fascism and the German and Italian armies. Over 2.5 million Indian soldiers served across the globe. They fought in North Africa, Italy, and Burma. They were the largest volunteer army in history, and they believed they were fighting for freedom. As the war ended in 1945, the contradiction was impossible to ignore. Britain claimed to defend liberty yet denied it in India. The economic toll of the war, the pressure from Indian nationalists, and growing unrest at home all forced Britain's hand. In 1946, Britain's Labour government began planning withdrawal. But a storm was brewing. The Muslim League, under Muhammad Ali Jinnah, demanded a separate Muslim nation, Pakistan. But the Indian National Congress, led by Jawaharlal Nehru and Gandhi, wanted a unified India, so the divide deepened. Violence erupted between Hindus and Muslims. Riots in Calcutta left thousands dead. Lord Louis Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India, arrived in 1947 with a mission: transfer power swiftly and, if necessary, divide the land. Despite Gandhi's desperate opposition to partition, on August 15, 1947, India was split in two, India and Pakistan. What followed was one of the largest and most traumatic migrations in human history, with over 15 million people being uprooted. Muslims fled to Pakistan, Hindus and Sikhs to India. Trains arrived full of corpses, villages burned. At least 1 million people died, some say many more. The British Empire's exit from India was not orderly. It was a retreat under duress, a surrender cloaked in ceremony. And as India raised its tricolour flag and Pakistan was born, the jewel in the imperial crown was gone. Just months later, on January 30, 1948, Gandhi was shot by a Hindu extremist, murdered by the very hatred he had tried to overcome. So we can see that the story of the British Raj is one of paradox. It's the story of railways and repression, of poets and prison cells. It's the story of how a subcontinent endured nearly a century under foreign rule, and how, through words more than weapons, it reclaimed its voice. And yet, the legacy remains. India and Pakistan remain scarred by partition. The borders drawn in haste became flashpoints for decades of conflict. Kashmir, a beautiful valley, turned into a battleground, and the echoes of empire still ripple today. But from those shadows rose independent nations, vibrant, complex, and resilient. Nations that bear the mark of British influence, but refuse to be defined by it. The Raj may have ended in 1947, but its consequences are still unfolding. In the next episode, we'll explore another painful chapter in the history of the British Empire, the transatlantic slave trade and slavery in the Caribbean, a story of unimaginable suffering, resistance, and survival. But for now, remember this: empires fall, but their stories remain. And sometimes, the most powerful revolutions begin not with violence, but with a single word: freedom. What do you think about the British Empire in India? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us what parts of imperial history you want us to uncover next. And if you love histories and mysteries, subscribe to Obscura Historia today.